So I like to watch debates between Vaush and, other people. In this case, the thing that prompted me was watching a debate between he and Count Dankula. And it was very interesting. The debate between Vaush and Count Dankula doesn't really go anywhere. It's mostly a dead end, like a lot of debates with Vaush. But at the beginning, there is something that could have actually evolved into a real discussion. And it begins with Vaush defining the word white supremacy, the conceit of the entire debate being that Count Dankula is a white supremacist because he has white supremacist followers and says naughty heterodox things about race.
So, generally speaking, when I say white supremacist, I'm referring to a person who believes that there is A, some sort of fundamental distinction between the races, and B, one who believes that either the white race is superior in some empirical sense, or B, that we need to engage in policies or other social actions to prioritize that group of people. There are a lot of, for example, white supremacists who will say, like, well, I'm not a white supremacist because I recognize that Asians and Ashkenazi Jews have a higher IQ, but fundamentally they still advocate for white people.
For me, I would go with the actual definition, which is a person that feels that white people are superior to all other races and all other races are or should be subservient to whites and things should be done only for the benefit of whites.
Vaush, do you have any issues with that definition?
Yeah, that's not the actual definition at all. That's a highly unacademic definition of white supremacy.
It's very interesting. In defining the term white supremacy, being the positive position, Vaush gets the floor first, and he lets out a very vague but also very broad definition, which is essentially that white supremacy is, in his view, a mix of cultural essentialism on the one hand, and on the other hand, white advocacy. Now, neither of these come even close in action to what common English speakers would call white supremacy. The former doesn't even have whiteness as an aspect of it. But the reason that he does this is very obviously, and he admits it later, because white supremacy, as Count Dankula defines it, believing whites are, incontrovertibly superior to other races, is a term that applies to almost nobody, as it is presently. And it becomes very, very difficult to get someone to admit they are a white supremacist in Count Dankula's terms, even if they really do believe that. Which Vaush says, and he's correct in saying that. But his definition is as illusory to prove that somebody fits into, and is, funnily enough, less descriptive of the real term. Now, this is not the interesting disagreement that I want to cover. The interesting disagreement is when Vaush defends this I'll argue, linguistically inherently incorrect definition off the pretense of it being an academic definition. You see, Count Dankula derives the term white supremacy from the constituent parts whiteness and supremacy, and he calls that the real definition. And in response, Vaush says it's not the real definition because his definition, Vaush's definition, is the academic definition. This is an appeal to epistemological exaltation. That despite the term that you're using being non-common, or linguistically speaking, incorrect, it comes from a group who has epistemologically higher ground. They have higher standing. And therefore you're allowed to have a lapse in accuracy or precision for the moment to appeal to the group that's smarter, or the group that has more epistemological ground. But I'll argue that's incorrect even on an academic level. The term is inherently nonsensical, and that's academic consensus, because of the nature of prescriptive and descriptive terms in a language. See, in linguistics, there's this big divide. I don't really want to say divide, but there's this big tendency, I should say, within linguistics to opt for a system of definition, a system of description that is descriptive, which means that a language, seen really as the consequence of a certain linguistic community speaking, can only be described in those terms that that linguistic community assigns to those words. With prescriptivism being anything that is not that. Prescriptivism is any sort of description which is not based on what the speakers themselves think words mean. Think of, less and fewer, for example. If anybody were to get upset at 10 items or less being on a grocery store checkout aisle, then they would be incorrect linguistically speaking, because that is what the average English speaker thinks is correct. Even if in older English or in more formal English, it's incorrect. The person saying that it must be 10 items or fewer is a linguistic prescriptivist, which is a sort of tendency so anti-linguistic that it's not even unpopular, it's just not a part of the field of linguistics. Defining words in that way is not a linguistic tendency. But This is interesting because what it means is that the term academic definition is essentially the implication of a definition which is not definitional. It's a description which is not descriptive, that is to say. A prescriptive description is inherently contradictory, and that's what the academic definition Vaush purports to provide is. It's a non-descriptive description. And the reason that Vaush would defend that is off the pretense that in a debate you need great precision with the terms you use. You need great precision in terms of the meaning of the words that you use, and I'd agree with that. And to get this descriptive precision, you need to start off the debate by saying what the words that you'll use mean in terms of their semantic reduction, the broader terms that constitute the terms you're using. In this case, he's defining white supremacy to be cultural essentialism and white advocacy, saying that the term white supremacy reduces down to those two ideas. Okay. If you are using the language that you purport to be English in a debate, then you have to use the meaning of the terms that is in English. That is to say, if you're redefining terms off the basis of precision, you cannot sacrifice accuracy. And what he's doing here is sacrificing accuracy. The average English speaker would not look at, cultural essentialism, which really is present in every ideology, including Vaush's, and say that that's white supremacy. And what's funny about this is that it means the academic consensus on the definition of words and what words mean and how they function is actually entirely contrary to not just Vaush's point about the academic definition of a word, but is contrary to the pretense behind saying that such a thing exists. The academic consensus in linguistics would be that there is no such thing as an academic definition. It's an inherent negation. It's a non-descriptive description. Now, why is Vaush doing this? Now, he says in the debate that it's because a vague term is superior in some sense. It's superior when you're referring to illusory terms, as white supremacy is, which is correct in some sense. And he's saying that it's because white supremacy per se, the term white supremacy that is descriptive in the mind of every English speaker, applies to basically nobody. It's a really difficult term. And what this is a very complicated sort of tactic that's being used. But recall back to the Aristotelian forms of rhetoric. Aristotle delineates three forms of rhetoric broadly used in a debate. They are logos, discursive speech, speech in terms of semantics, speech in terms of meaning, deductive and inductive speech, pathos, which is Greek for passion, but it more so means appeal to the visceral instinct of the audience. And then ethos, which is Greek for, it can mean a lot of things, but in this case it's used to mean credibility, or your standing. And what's interesting here is Vaush begins with an appeal to ethos. He begins with an appeal to the credibility of academics, who he doesn't name, and who may not perhaps exist, in providing the supposed academic definition that he uses throughout the debate, and asserts early on that is the correct term to use in this debate. Now, that appeal to ethos is a way for him to separate the two other parts of the argument that are significant, the pathos and the logos. The logos, the discursive debate here, the debate qua meaning and words and deduction, induction, all those things. That comes down to the term that he is redefining and that he has the prerogative to redefine, white supremacy, qua cultural essentialism and white advocacy, definition that he rewrote. And while it is incorrect but in some sense valid to redefine terms in a debate, it becomes both invalid and incorrect when you're in a public setting, as he is, because there's not only a implication qua logos to calling someone a white supremacist in these terms, that is to say, there's not only an implication in the terms that Vaush is using explicitly, but there's also the unchanging, permanent, pragmatic implication is what it's called in linguistics. That is, there's an appeal to pathos inherent in calling somebody a white supremacist that is interestingly decoupled from the logos. You see, if you call somebody a white supremacist, no matter how much at the beginning of the debate you redefine what that term means, the visceral impact of that word does not change for the audience. The audience doesn't cleanly change the pragmatics of that term to fit the new semantics that you've put onto it. In linguistics, keeping in mind, pragmatics refers to essentially the pathos of a word, the word qua the broader linguistic community at large, and the logos, the semantics of a word. Logos in Greek literally meaning language in a lot of contexts. The semantics refers to the direct analytical meaning of a word. Yelling fire in a building to get people to run away from a fire, that's a entirely pragmatic utterance. It's an utterance towards towards social ends, and saying fire with regard to an actual fire that exists, like a campfire or something, in a declarative sentence, that's not pragmatic at all, basically. That's entirely semantic. That's a definition just referring to the object of fire in front of you. So words have this dual sort of meaning, and one of them appeals very strongly to logos and one applies very strongly to pathos. And it's important to keep in mind that one of them is unchanging. You cannot change the pragmatic implication of a word. That would necessitate you confirming every viewer agree on this novel pragmatic implication of a word, which is impossible. What is very possible, and what Vaush demands on doing, is redefining the logos of a word, redefining the semantic hit of the word to be very, very weak in this context. The term white supremacy that he's defining applies to a lot of ideologies. And we'll see later on his, equal treatment of the word ethno-nationalism even applies to him himself. It's so broad. That decoupling of the logos and pathos, that taking a word and separating its semantics into something extremely broad and boring, but keeping the visceral impact of calling somebody a white supremacist, keeping the pragmatic pathos of calling somebody an ethno-nationalist or a white supremacist, is what his entire debate relies on. In fact, the name of the debate that Vaush has with Sargon, which I'll talk about later, is Debating Sargon of Akkad and Exposing Him as a White Nationalist. It's very interesting. The pragmatic and the potent pathological, literally pathological, impact of that phrase remains, no matter how much at the beginning of the debate he redefines these terms to be neutered, extremely castrated. The redefinitions of these terms are as castrated as the 17-year-old boy that he fucks. It's very, very weak. They are robbed of the semantic backdrop that rightly endows these words, white supremacist, ethno-nationalist, with the punch that they have in the pragmatic sense of them, in the pathos sense of them. And essentially, what this means is that he's able to have one discussion with his opponent, a discussion qua logos, qua semantics, qua meaning, and give a different implication to his audience, an implication qua pragmatics, an implication qua social implications. You can have two discussions at once, one of which is somewhat honest, the other of which is mostly dishonest, and this allows you to basically contort the meaning of the word such that it's not only incorrect, in terms of, as we derive, academic definitions being inherently incorrect, but it's also invalid. You're using two separate terms and necessitating that your audience will accept the one that you're not using qua logos. The one that you're using qua pathos is the one that you want to provide to your audience in this case. Now, for a even more explicit version of this happening, we can look at the debate that Vaush had, as I've mentioned before, with Sargon of Akkad, in which he says Sargon of Akkad is an ethno-nationalist because he believes, in really the most minimal sense possible, that the nation of England is defined partially in terms of the English ethnicity. And it should be very obvious to anybody the term ethno-nationalism is not merely derived. It has a strong pragmatic punch, as does the word white supremacy. However, it's interesting to note, the term is even more neutered than Vaush's errant definition of white supremacist. In fact, ethno-nationalist does have a real semantic definition, and its real semantic definition is, unlike white supremacy, extremely weak. The definition is essentially defining a nation, to any extent, on the basis of ethnicity. And the definition of ethnicity that I believe Oxford uses is a social group that shares a common nation or cultural tradition. Now, what's very funny, and what you'll find actually, is that this very, very weak definition actually applies to Vaush's ideology of Marxism, and that sounds absurd on the face of it. I'm definitely not arguing that he is an ethno-nationalist. I'm arguing the term is so weak as to apply to him as well. Marxists believe in something called the base and the superstructure, essentially that economic units form cultural units, that the economic participants in a society form and mold the cultural elements, what Marx calls the superstructure. And what's very interesting is that means that the proletarian and bourgeois classes, the industrial capitalist classes, according to Marx, do in fact fit that very, very weak, again, parochially fit that definition of ethnicity. which is hilarious. It shows how weak that term is, because they are a social group which fit a common cultural tradition. They, as people that form and shape the superstructure, have a certain cultural tradition. One could argue it's not differentiated between the proletarian and bourgeoisie. I don't think that any Marxist would actually argue that. That sounds absurd. But if they were to, then you could just jump to the next implication, which is that Marx believes we'll at one point form a transitionary state that leads into a dictatorship of the proletariat. A dictatorship of the proletariat, in this sense, would have to be superstructurally different. It would have to be culturally different, because the base, the system of production, has changed. That is the prime difference between capitalism and communism, according to Marx. And very funnily, changing that system, defining a nation on the basis of proletarian dictatorship, fits that, again, absurd and myopic definition of ethno-nationalist. It is defining a nation in terms of a social group that shares a common cultural tradition. Again, this is not to show that Marxists are actually ethno-nationalists. This is a very neutered version of the term, a very neutered version of ethno-nationalism coupled with a really parochial version of Marxism. However, it does apply equally well if a Marxist is to accept that proletarian and bourgeois people form their own superstructure when left to their own devices, as I believe they would. And if they are to believe that a dictatorship of the proletariat would have a unique superstructure to a capitalistic system that is essentially a dictatorship of the bourgeoisie. If you are to believe that, then Marx is advocating for, in Vaush's weak terms, an ethno-state. This is very clearly dishonest, it's very clearly inaccurate, and it's very clearly trying to apply a really strong pragmatic term, ethno-state, to a very weak semantic term, which is a nation defined by shared culture, basically. This is actually a definition that I would argue every single conception of a nation holds, as would be evidenced by the fact that the essentially furthest left anthropological theory, Marxism, does not actually avoid being ethno-nationalist, again, in Vaush's very weak terms. Now, this is another case of linguistic dissonance. In my case, I'm showing how absurd the term is. And the linguistic dissonance is basically an appeal to pathos here under the guise of logos. It is under the guise of logos that Vaush classifies Sargon of Akkad as being an ethno-nationalist according to those very, very broad terms. However, what he's doing is appealing to his audience using pathos. This is evident in the name of the video. The video is named Debating Sargon of Akkad and exposing him as a white nationalist. Funnily enough, he never uses the term white nationalist in the video. He never substantiates that he is a white nationalist. However, it's very clear from that title that what he's going for is a pragmatic, pathological attack, not a logistic, semantic attack. And he uses his very, very weak guise of semantics to provide this very, very strong, pathological again, but strong, rhetorical argument against him, saying that he's an ethno-nationalist, something that a liberal qua Vaush or a liberal qua Sargon would probably not like, would probably associate against by default. Now, one thing that I think is important to finish on is how leftism brings about this worldview. And what I think it comes down to is, if you have an ideology that is aesthetically pro-science, that is aesthetically pro-method, anti-pseudoscience, then it's very easy to hear a term like academic definition and have an immediate, again, pragmatic, positive reaction to it, to think that sounds very nice and friendly and scientific. And that will lead you into circumstances where you essentially don't question those apparent and obvious internal contradictions. The term academic definition, as we saw, is a description without description. It's contradictory, it's paradoxical. It's worse than paradoxical, it really is internally contradictory. And this is a consequence of the common left-wing worldview where you hold epistemological exaltation to the specter of scientific consensus, the specter of the scientific community, something that cannot really be divined unless you are in the scientific community, something that certainly can't be delineated unless you're in the scientific community. However, something that these people tend to appeal to pragmatically, pre-rationally, subconsciously, but very, very strongly. And that means terms like academic definition feel very friendly. They feel very nice and clean and scientific to the viewers of Vaush, to the viewers of a lot of left-wing streamers, a lot of left-wing political streamers. And it's important to see that this expands just beyond prescriptivism and descriptivism. It's a common tactic used by left-wing people, but once you understand the linguistic dissonance, the decoupling of semantics and pragmatics, you'll see it everywhere. So that prescriptive-descriptive distinction, it comes up in a lot more places, and I may want to make videos on other circumstances of Vaush, using it, or maybe not just Vaush himself, but other streamers, other left-wing streamers. Destiny does something similar, albeit in a somewhat different way. Interestingly, a similar fallacy, although not the same one, is used in asserting the existence of a linguistic consensus, although it's non-standard the way in which I would make that argument. But I may get into that later.